"I hate his guts." That phrase captures everything you need to know about Terry Hill, one of rugby league's most talented and terrifying centres to ever step foot on the field. When you talk about crossing the line, about taking things too far, about a player who operated completely out of bounds when it came to personal vendettas, you're talking about Terry Hill. The man was a giant personality with a prodigiously talented football mind, but he was also ruthless, brutal, and absolutely willing to destroy opponents and teammates alike if it served his purpose. His impact on the game was undeniable, his skill was legendary, but his feuds were equally unforgettable. Today we're breaking down the 6 players Terry Hill absolutely couldn't stand. The 6 targets who felt the full force of his psychological warfare, his relentless aggression, and his complete refusal to show mercy. But here's the thing that makes this story matter right now. Terry Hill passed away in 2024 at the age of 52. His death brought all of these old rivalries back in focus. People started talking about the feuds again, about the intensity, about the way he used hate as a weapon. Former opponents began acknowledging that what Hill did, as ruthless as it was, had become a fundamental part of rugby league folklore. This is the story of those feuds, and you need to give this video some hype right now if you're ready to dive into the darker side of one of the game's most complex figures. Number 6 brings us to the Johns brothers, Andrew and Matthew, who arrived in the New South Wales representative camps in the early 1990s as cocky newcomers who believed their talent alone would carry them forward. They were heralded as the future of the game, young guns from Newcastle with a free-spirited energy that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid, abrasive cultures Hill had lived in his entire career. Hill played for Souths, for Wests, for Manly, clubs steeped in tradition and toughness, and when these fresh-faced brothers showed up thinking they could just waltz into the Blues setup without paying their dues, Hill took it as a personal insult. His mission became crystal clear: humble them, strip away their cockiness, make them understand that talent alone meant nothing in the world of representative rugby league. Hill used his seniority like a weapon during training camp drills. He targeted both brothers relentlessly, applying constant physical pressure and sledging that was designed to deflate their confidence before they even stepped onto the field. Andrew Johns, despite his prodigious talent, was subjected to this psychological warfare right from the start. Hill saw it as his duty as an old guard enforcer to test whether these newcomers had the grit required to survive at the highest level. The tactic was selective sledging combined with brutal physical training pressure, all meant to assert the dominance of the veterans and remind the brothers that respect had to be earned, never given. This was Hill's form of professional gatekeeping, a way to enforce the hierarchy that he believed had been established long before these kids arrived. It was terrifying to many of his peers, this intensity and this refusal to cut anyone slack. But here's what matters for our story. Andrew Johns would go on to become an immortal of the game, one of the greatest players to ever play rugby league. His early years, though, those were marked by these humbling experiences at Hill's hands. Even though mutual respect would eventually develop between them later in life, the early friction showed exactly who Hill was and what he believed the game required. He was the self-appointed moral and physical enforcer, and he was absolutely relentless in that role. Number 5 takes us to Tim Brasher, and this one might be the most sustained professional friction of Hill's entire career. These two players represented a clash of complete archetypes. Brasher was the golden boy, polished, versatile, associated with Balmain Tigers and the successful Sydney Roosters. He was media-friendly, a utility player who could fit into any team system, and selectors loved him for it. Hill, by contrast, was the outsider, the lippy centre from western suburbs, who had to fight through a courtroom just to play for the club of his choice. Hill had challenged the NSWRL draft in the early 1990s and won a landmark case that protected players from being forced to sign with clubs they didn't want to play for. That victory meant everything to Hill. It meant he believed in the system, the structure, the tradition. When he looked at Brasher, he saw someone benefiting from a system that favoured the polished over the gritty. Hill felt he had to brutally expose Brasher's weaknesses at every opportunity, proving that style couldn't match substance when it came to real centre play. Throughout the entire 1990s, when selectors had to choose between Hill and Brasher for the New South Wales Blues, it was a constant tension. Both were competing for the same representative jerseys. Hill earned 14 matches for NSW, while Brasher earned 21. Hill played 9 test matches for Australia, while Brasher played 16. The numbers alone tell you the system favoured Brasher, and that gnawed at Hill. When they finally ended up in the same squad together in the 1997 and 1998 Origin series, the atmosphere was one of mutual suspicion and competitive distance. Even wearing the same blue jersey didn't change the friction. Hill's disdain for Brasher's golden boy status was rooted in his broader intolerance for anyone he felt lacked the toughness required to be a genuine representative centre. This wasn't just personal preference. For Hill, it was about maintaining standards, about protecting the game from being taken over by polished players who didn't have the grit that had built rugby league in the first place. His friction with Brasher ensured that the rivalry lasted a full decade, simmering beneath the surface even when they were supposed to be on the same team. Number 4 shifts our focus to the Super League rebels. And this one goes beyond personal dislike into something deeper, something ideological. The 1997 Super League War split Australian Rugby League completely apart. One side was the Australian Rugby League, the traditional game, the ARL. The other side was Super League, backed by News Limited, offering massive money to players willing to jump ship. Hill was a staunch ARL loyalist who had zero respect for anyone who sold out the game for financial incentives. This wasn't just club loyalty or player preference. For Hill, the ARL represented the true game, the real game, and anyone who abandoned it for Super League had abandoned rugby league's core values. His loyalty ran deep because of his own history fighting for player rights within the traditional system. When he won that draft case in the early 1990s, it proved that players could gain freedom and respect without abandoning the game itself. Hill believed in the system he had fought for. When he saw players choosing Super League money, he saw them taking a shortcut, undermining the collective struggle of the old guard, the players who had built the sport through tradition and toughness. The friction was palpably felt in 1995 season, when Hill's Manly side, a bastion of ARL loyalty, faced off against rebel clubs like the Bulldogs. The Bulldogs players had taken Super League money. In Hill's view, they had sold out. These matches weren't just rugby league games, they were ideological battles. The stakes were physical on the field, but they were also moral, spiritual even. Hill carried his moral authority into every collision, every hit-up, every piece of sledging. His vocal opposition to Super League meant he became the representative of Western Suburbs grit, the fighter who stood against the corporate gloss of the new league. His mutual dislike for Super League players was a defining feature of his career in the late 1990s. He viewed himself as defending the integrity of the game, protecting tradition against the forces trying to commercialize and corrupt rugby league. To Hill, this wasn't about grudges. This was about right and wrong. This was about staying true to what rugby league meant. Number 3 brings us back to Mark Spud Carroll, and this relationship shows something completely different from Hill's other feuds. Before they became teammates at Manly in the mid-1990s, Hill and Carroll were fierce enemies. They traded blows, they traded insults. They regularly engaged in on-field violence during matches between South Sydney, Eastern Suburbs, and Western Suburbs. Carroll was a bruising prop, a collision specialist who loved the physical war of rugby league. They should have been natural enemies forever. Instead, they became teammates, but their relationship stayed volatile and intense. Hill's unique talent was manipulating Carroll's raw aggression for team benefit. Even after they were supposedly on the same side, Hill used his lippy nature to constantly provoke Carroll, keeping him on edge, using him as a weapon. The most violent example came during the 1995 season in a top-of-the-table clash against Newcastle Knights at Marathon Stadium. This wasn't just any game. Both teams were fighting for position and supremacy. Hill spent the entire week leading up to the match revving Carroll up, whispering provocations in his ear. "He's going to get you, Spud. Chief Harragon is going to bash you. Chief is going to destroy you." He kept saying it over and over, building up Carroll's aggression like a pressure cooker about to explode. When game day came, the pressure released in one of rugby league's most violent collisions. Carroll smashed into Paul Harragon with incredible force. It was a collision that defined the match, defined the season, but it also revealed something darker about Hill himself. During that same game, Hill lost control. He was sent off for a coat hanger tackle, an illegal play that resulted in a 6-week suspension. He didn't just instigate violence in his teammates. He was prone to extreme acts of illegal physicality himself. His own intolerance for opposition and his volatile nature came boiling out, and the suspension showed his own recklessness. Mark Carroll's autobiography revealed that Hill's provocations were a constant feature of their preparation, even as teammates supposedly on the same side. Hill maintained a level of abrasive pressure that kept even his friends on edge. The hatred Carroll spoke of in the mid-1990s wasn't something Hill tried to reduce. He actively fostered it, viewed it as essential to the game's integrity. Hill's disdain for complacency meant that even a friend like Carroll wasn't safe from the lippy treatment if it served to sharpen his competitive edge. This relationship shows the paradox at the heart of Hill's character. He could be both teammate and tormentor, both ally and antagonist. The line between motivation and cruelty was something Hill never really respected. Number 2 takes us to Braith Anasta and the most prominent example of Hill's systematic bullying. If the rivalry with Gordon Tallis was a clash between equals, what Hill did to Braith Anasta in the early 2000s represented psychological hazing that bordered on sadistic. Anasta was 18 years old when he debuted for Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs in 2000. He was the quintessential golden boy, a highly touted, polished prospect expected to lead the next generation of rugby league. He'd grown up up admiring Hill following his career with New South Wales and Manly, thinking this was a player he should respect and learn from. Hill was a battle-hardened veteran by that point, and he viewed Anasta as a target. The most prominent instance of Hill's bullying came in round 22 of 2001. Bulldogs were playing West Tigers at Sydney Showground. Anasta was still young, still learning, still trying to establish himself at the highest level. Hill decided to make his welcome to the big leagues absolutely brutal and unforgettable. For 80 full minutes, Hill terrorized the 18-year-old centre. He followed Anasta from one side of the field to the other, never giving him space, never giving him distance. He chirped away constantly, maintaining a relentless stream of sledging that never stopped, never let up. Anasta couldn't get comfortable. Anasta couldn't feel secure in his role. This wasn't just reaction to what was happening in the game. This was premeditated. This was planned. Hill's objective was clear. He wanted to destroy Anasta's mental composure, to break down the golden boy and prove that talent alone meant nothing in professional rugby league. By following Anasta all around the park, Hill removed the physical distance that usually gives a playmaker the space to think, to organise, to control the game. Hill stripped that away completely. The power dynamic was brutal. Here was an 11-year veteran against an 18-year-old rookie. Here was a terrifying operator against a kid just trying to survive. Hill showed no mercy. He was ruthless and terrifying in equal measure. Anasta later reflected on this experience as funny and awesome in hindsight, but the immediate impact was pure professional gate. Hill's commitment to terrorizing this kid highlighted his belief that entry into rugby league's elite ranks required a baptism of fire. This specific disdain was reserved for players Hill felt were being handed opportunities without having their mental resilience properly tested. The Golden Boy versus Western Suburbs grit narrative wasn't just media hype. It was a lived reality for rookies like Anasta who fell into Hill's crosshairs. Hill believed he was testing them, strengthening them, forcing them to prove they belonged. The cruelty was, in his mind, necessary. Number 1 brings us to Gordon Tallis and the moment that became the defining image of Hill's professional rivalries. This took place during 1999 State of Origin Game 2 at Stadium Australia. The entire crowd was 88,336 people, a record-breaking attendance that showed the passion fans had. These were the best players from New South Wales playing against the best players from Queensland. These were states at war with each other. Terry Hill played centre for New South Wales. Gordon Tallis, the Raging Bull, played for Queensland. Just 5 minutes into the first half, Hill took exception to a tackle initiated by Tallis. What happened next became iconic. The two players went nose to nose, jersey grabbing, pushing, a teeth-clenching display of aggression that looked absolutely genuine, absolutely personal. Tallis later claimed he was just protecting a teammate, asserting that Hill had roughed up a Queensland player and Tallis was intervening in the heat of battle. But the intensity of that nose-to-nose square-off, those Eskimo kisses that the commentators kept mentioning, suggested something deeper, something more rooted in genuine personal friction that had nothing to do with teammate protection. Hill's reputation as a known sledger, as someone who had been lippy from a young age, suggests this was strategic irritation. Hill's ability to get under the skin of opponents like Tallis was core to his defensive strategy. He identified volatile opponents and applied maximum psychological pressure to provoke undisciplined responses. Tallis was exactly the kind of opponent Hill targeted, someone who could be wound up, someone who could be made to react, someone whose aggression could be turned into a liability. What makes this moment even more remarkable is what happened after the match ended. The Australian Rugby League Commission and media partners immediately co-opted this Hill-Tallis confrontation as a central marketing tool. The iconic photograph of the two players hating each other, locked in that intense square-off, was utilised for over 2 decades to encapsulate the passion and desperation of the Origin arena. This commodification of personal animosity highlights something unique in rugby league history. The performance of hatred became a functional asset for the league's commercial growth. They sold that image. They used that image. They profited from that image. Hill and Tallis gave them a moment of genuine visceral conflict, and the league turned it into marketing gold. While Tallis maintained that it was merely mate versus mate, state versus state in the heat of battle, Hill's reputation as a known sledger who was lippy from a young age tells a different story. This was deliberate. This was calculated. Hill had identified a highly volatile opponent and applied pressure to provoke a reaction. This specific interaction with Tallis served as the prototype for Hill's broader pattern of professional friction. Identify the enemy, apply pressure, wait for them to crack under the weight of his intensity. This was his method, this was his weapon, this was how Terry Hill operated. Terry Hill's passing in 2024 at the age of 52 brought all of these old rivalries back into focus. Former targets, including Braith and Asta, acknowledged that Hill's ruthless behaviour was fundamental to his character and the game's folklore. Hill didn't just dislike his rivals. He utilised his disdain as a functional tool. He used hate to disrupt the performance of elite players like Tallis and Annister. He used hate to manipulate the aggression of teammates like Carroll. He used hate to enforce a rigid hierarchical structure within representative camps. His brutal exposure of rivals was calculated, designed to maintain the western suburbs grit that he felt was being eroded by the professionalisation and commercialisation of rugby league. He was talented, he was brilliant, but he also crossed lines that most players wouldn't dream of crossing. He held grudges, he played moral gatekeeping roles with aggressive intent. He believed that on-field hatred was necessary, that mutual dislike was the only form of professional respect that truly mattered. His interactions with these 6 targets collectively define an era of rugby league where one lippy centre from western suburbs became the ultimate arbiter of professional and personal toughness. His legacy remains part of rugby league's fabric, a testament to the intensity of the sport during that era. Even old rivals eventually remembered the intensity as absolutely essential to who Hill was and what that time period represented for the game. Michael Tuck played 426 games over 2 decades. The man is basically a legend, a living legend, an Iron Man. But here's what's interesting. Here's what people don't talk about enough. Michael Tuck couldn't stand these 6 other legends. Not in some petty way. These players absolutely drove him crazy. They made his career miserable on the field. They were the nightmare opponents he had to outlast. But without them, without that friction, without that constant pressure, Tuck might never have become the Iron Man everyone knows today. This is the story of the 6 players who made Michael Tuck's life an absolute mission. If you're already feeling how intense this is about to get, hit that hype feature right now and give this video some hype, because these next names get way crazier from here, and you'll want to experience every second of this. Number 6 on this list is Phil Carman. Fabulous Phil Carman. This guy is the only one on this entire list who actually created a permanent scar on the history of the Victorian Football League itself. Not because of his skill, because of his temper. In the 1977 second semi-final, Carman struck Michael Tuck. This wasn't some forgettable scuffle. This was the hit that changed everything. Carman got suspended for 2 matches for that strike. 2 matches. Those 2 matches meant he missed the drawn 1977 grand final and the replay that came after it. Think about that for a second. Because of his indiscipline, his inability to control himself for 90 minutes, Carman cost his entire team. Collingwood believed they should have won that premiership. Coach Tom Harvey thought Carman's absence was the reason they lost, and that hung over Tuck for the rest of his life. This wasn't about the physical damage. It was nothing in terms of injury. It was about the weight of the aftermath. Tuck was worried he'd be blamed. He was concerned people would point at him and say he got Carman suspended. He'd be the guy who benefited from Carman's stupidity. That created a psychological burden that Tuck carried for decades. The friction with Carman was fundamental. It was about 2 completely different approaches to the game. Tuck was the ultimate team man. His discipline, his consistency, his refusal to let emotion control him, that's what allowed him to play 426 games. Carman was the opposite. He was a loner. He had little regard for team disciplines. He'd leave training early when he felt like he'd done enough. The man wasted talent. He had immense talent, but squandered it through sheer indiscipline. Carman's whole career was one incident after another. In 1978, he struck Rod Ashman and got cleared. Then in 1980, he headbutted boundary umpire Graham Carberry and got suspended for 20 matches. This was a guy who couldn't control his impulses. For a professional like Tuck, who viewed football as a job that required absolute commitment, Carman represented everything wrong with taking the game for granted. The chaos that Carman brought, the unnecessary drama, it threatened the integrity of the premiership itself. And for Tuck, that was unforgivable. It forced him into a story he never asked to be part of. Number 5 is Wayne Carey. But Carey's situation was different. Tuck didn't dislike him because of indiscipline. He disliked him because Carey represented the end of an era. The end of Tuck's era? As Michael Tuck was entering the final stages of his career in the early 1990s, the sport was changing. The whole game was shifting. The era of the plumber footballer, the guy who did the hard work, who grounded out, who made everyone else look good, that era was dying, and the primary symbol of that change was Wayne Carey. Carey was the new breed of centre-half forward. He had the physical attributes of a ruckman combined with the agility of a rover. He could destroy opposition sides. For a veteran like Tuck, who built his career on aerobic endurance and positional craft, Carey's physical dominance was terrifying. It was a sign the game was moving past the 1980s standards. It was moving past guys like Tuck. The friction here wasn't personal, it was existential. Tuck's whole philosophy was built on the idea that hard work and endurance could overcome anything. But Carey introduced explosive power that tested that philosophy's limits. Their careers barely overlapped, but the impact was profound. Tuck's career was winding down just as Carey's was exploding. dominating. This period of transition was difficult for many veterans of the 1970s because the speed and the impact of the game was increasing constantly. The gap was widening. Carey was the king of this new landscape, more aggressive, more explosive, more demanding than anything Tuck had faced before. Carey was the player who most clearly signaled to Tuck that the brutal era was being replaced by something even more physically demanding. The difficulty Tuck had with Carey was recognizing that there was a new standard of athleticism that made all the old methods of containment completely obsolete. The game had evolved past him, and Carey was the living proof of it. Number 4 is Bruce Dole. Bruce Dole from Carlton, the flying doormat. This guy was a haunting anomaly in the hypermasculine, often very vocal environment of the 1970s and 80s VFL. Dole was famously silent. He rarely spoke to the media. He barely spoke to his own teammates during the heat of battle. That silence was intentional. That was his power. For Michael Tuck, who operated in a Hawthorn side that absolutely prided itself on vocal accountability and physical presence, Dole's quiet, relentless efficiency was a completely different kind of irritant. It was harder to deal with. You can combat aggression, you can match intensity, but how do you respond to a guy who just doesn't engage with you? Dole was a master of the half-back flank. That position allowed him to intercept Hawthorn's forward thrusts and launch counterattacks for Carlton with clinical precision. He was positioned perfectly, always 2 steps ahead of where the play was going. Tuck has noted his admiration for Dole's ability to dominate without engaging in the theatre of the era, but that admiration was tempered by frustration because Dole was relentlessly obstructive. In many Carlton versus Hawthorn battles in the early 1980s, Dole was the reason Tuck's midfield delivery failed to result in goals. He moved the opposition's attack, disrupted the timing, made the Hawks uncomfortable. Everything felt off when Dole was on the field playing against them. The frustration with Dole was that there was no traditional leverage. You couldn't intimidate him. You couldn't talk him out of the game. You could rarely outposition him. Every trick in the book failed. He was universally loved among fans. Everyone adored Bruce Dole, but for an opponent like Tuck, he was a cold, efficient machine, a robot almost. He neutralized the Hawks' greatest strengths and did it without saying a word. The rivalry between the two was a pure battle of endurance. Dole played 356 games. He won 4 premierships. He mirrored Tuck's own path of longevity and success. He was the roadblock that required the most patience to dismantle. His very lack of personality made him more formidable and more frustrating as an opponent. Number 3 is Gary Ablett Sr., and this one is complicated. This one is intense. The relationship between Michael Tuck and Gary Ablett Sr. is one of the most complex in Australian sporting history. It's intertwined by family connections and extreme professional violence. Tuck was the brother-in-law of Ablett Sr. He was the uncle to Gary Ablett Jr., so Tuck had a front-row seat to the most spectacular individual talent the game had ever seen. Up close, personal, in family gatherings. But on the field, particularly during the 1989 VFL Grand Final, that talent was a source of profound physical and psychological distress for Tuck. Tuck has argued that Ablett Sr. was superior to his son because he achieved feats while constantly besieged by opponents. In Tuck's era, there was no protection for star players. To kick 9 goals in a grand final required almost superhuman physical resilience. Tuck described that match as brutal. Bones were smashed, lungs were punctured. Hawthorn barely held off a fast-finishing Geelong. The 1989 Grand Final remains the pinnacle of high-stakes friction. Tuck was captaining the Hawks to back-to-back flags, but he was being forced to manage a team that was being systematically dismantled by one man's brilliance. One man, Ablett. No matter what tactical adjustments Tuck and coach Alan Jeans made, Ablett continued to score. Nothing worked. The system failed. That's the worst feeling a leader can have. That helplessness. Tuck's own injury in that match, a split webbing in his hand, was a minor casualty compared to the broader carnage happening around him. Dermot Brereton had broken ribs. Bodies everywhere. The frustration Tuck felt was the frustration of a system-oriented leader facing an unsystemicable force, an unsolvable problem that he had to live with. This inability to stop the unstoppable is why Ablett occupies a singular place in Tuck's pantheon of adversaries. Even decades later, Tuck speaks of the fortunate nature of that win. He acknowledges that Ablett had brought the most successful machine in football history to the absolute brink of collapse. One man, one player, almost destroyed them all. That's how good Ablett Sr. was. That's how much he terrified Tuck. It wasn't the physical pain, it was the helplessness. Number 2 is Kevin Bartlett, the Richmond icon. If Lee Matthews was the internal standard that Tuck had to live up to every single day, Kevin Bartlett represented the external horizon, the goal that was always out of reach. Bartlett was the first player to breach the 400-game barrier. That was a feat that for years seemed unattainable, impossible. When Tuck was chasing that record later in his career, he was literally chasing Kevin Bartlett around the Melbourne Cricket Ground, around the MCG. The overlap of their careers placed Tuck in the constant position of trying to catch up, always behind, always pushing. The difficulty Tuck had with Bartlett was primarily tactical. Bartlett's style was a source of immense frustration. He was notorious for his aerobic capacity and his penchant for kicking rather than handballing, earning the moniker Hungry. For a midfielder like Tuck, who prioritized team-oriented plumbing, Bartlett's ability to find space and dictate terms was a constant irritation. He moved around the MCG like he owned it. He'd be everywhere at once, and you could never quite contain him. The rivalry between Hawthorn and Richmond during this era was visceral. It was real. Bartlett was the spearhead of the Tigers' offense during their most successful periods. He was their solution to every problem. When you needed something in Richmond's attack, you went to Bartlett. He was the player who could dominate the statistics and the scoreboard simultaneously. That combination tested Tuck's patience to its absolute limit. The couldn't-stand narrative with Bartlett relates to the professional headache he posed. Bartlett changed the geometry of the game. He forced Tuck to rethink his own defensive positioning for over a decade. Just when Tuck thought he had the game figured out, Bartlett would do something completely unpredictable. Bartlett's elusiveness meant that Tuck, who prided himself on his work rate and his consistency, was often forced into a defensive role that mitigated his own offensive impact. It neutralized him. He couldn't do what he was best at because he had to chase Bartlett. He had to shadow him. He had to stay with this guy who refused to play by the normal rules of the game. Number 1 is Leigh Matthews, the final name on this list, but in many ways the most important, the most impactful, the one who set everything in motion. While the public views Michael Tuck's career through the lens of collective success, through those 7 premierships, the internal environment at Hawthorn during the 1970s and 1980s was characterized by something brutal. It was a brutal form of accountability. And at the center of that entire culture was Leigh Matthews, the lethal. Matthews was more than just a teammate. He was the yardstick. He was the measuring stick against which every single player's toughness was measured. For Tuck, the friction with Matthews wasn't born out of traditional rivalry. It wasn't about competing for the same position or glory. It was about the exhausting requirement to maintain a level of intensity that Matthews dictated every single day. Matthews set the standard, and everyone else had to live up to it. There was no negotiation. There's a persistent myth that Tuck and Matthews, along with teammate Don Scott, harbored a mutual dislike. A lot of people believe they didn't actually get along. The perception was fueled by their divergent temperaments. Matthews was the aggressive, dominant protagonist of the VFL's most physical era. Tuck was the understated, endurance-focused plumber from Berwick. They seemed to come from different planets. Different worlds entirely. Observations from former teammates indicated that the trio rarely spoke off the field. They didn't bond. That led to skepticism about their partnership. But this wasn't about personal animosity. It was about compartmentalization. Matthews set a standard of physical intimidation and professional excellence that left no room for interpersonal warmth. You couldn't be friends. You had to be competitors. You had to be relentless. Matthews was a high possession winner who simultaneously served as one of the most prolific goal kickers in history. He'd win the ball. He'd move it. He'd kick goals, all at elite level. Meanwhile, Tuck was different. Tuck provided the volume and the connective tissue of the midfield. He was the glue. He made sure everything moved smoothly. The statistical divergence between them highlights why Matthews was such a demanding benchmark. Tuck played 426 games. Matthews played 332. But Matthews won 8 best and fairest awards. Tuck won 0. That gap was the friction. That gap was the pressure. The friction Tuck felt was perpetual. It was the constant need to support a player of Matthews's caliber who refused to accept anything less than total commitment. If you weren't all in, Matthews would let you know. He would make you feel it. He would show you up. In Tuck's estimation, Matthews was the player who set the standard for everyone at the club, a standard that forced Tuck to evolve. He went from being a lean rover into a durable, versatile follower, capable of sustaining the Hawthorn way for 2 entire decades. Matthews made him better, but it cost him. It demanded everything. And here's the thing everyone needs to understand. Michael Tuck played 426 games. He won 7 premierships. He did all of that while working as a plumber in Berwick. Throughout his entire career, even as he was captaining premierships and breaking records, Tuck maintained his work outside of football. He'd wake up at 6 in the morning and handle plumbing jobs before training. That was his reality. That blue-collar mentality, that perspective, that's what saved him. It allowed him to treat the physical threats posed by Leigh Matthews, or the tactical headaches from Kevin Bartlett as professional problems to be solved, not personal affronts. They weren't disrespecting him. They were just doing their jobs better than he was, so he had to improve. The couldn't stand sentiment should be viewed through this lens. These players weren't personal enemies. They were difficult jobs, jobs that required the most effort, the most resilience, the most patience. The brutal era of the 1970s and 80s was a time when the game was as much about physical survival as it was about skill. Tuck's split hand webbing in the 1989 Grand Final, an injury he claimed he would have played through if a replay was required, that's a testament to this mentality. He did not have the luxury of standing or not standing his opponents in a personal sense. He simply had to outlast them. He had to be there longer. He had to be tougher. He had to want it more. Michael Tuck's career ended in 1991 with a 7th premiership. A fitting conclusion, he started in the suburban mud of the early 1970s. He ended at the peak, captaining the Hawks to another flag. The 6 players he struggled with were architects of his greatness. Without Matthews' pressure, Tuck might not have survived 20 years. Without Bartlett and Dahl's tactical brilliance, he might not have remained relevant. Without Ablett and Carey's power, he might not have understood his body's limits. Without Carman, he might not have appreciated the discipline that became his trademark. Tuck's 426 games are a monument to the endurance of the plumber in an era of superstars. These were the guys who did the work nobody saw, the guys who made everyone else better, the guys who showed up even when they were hurt, even when they were tired, even when the game was changing around them. His difficulty with these 6 legends was the friction of a man who valued the collective above all else, facing individuals who redefined the possibilities of the sport itself, for better or worse. Ablett redefined what one player could do. Carey showed what athleticism could become. Bartlett and Dahl proved there were different ways to win. Matthews set the tone for an entire era. Carman showed what happens when you abandon the collective and abandon discipline. The architecture of Tuck's longevity was built on the stones thrown at him by his rivals. Every challenge made him stronger. Every obstacle forced adaptation. Every frustration drove him to be better. His ability to stand in the face of that pressure remains the defining achievement of the VFL and AFL era. Michael Tuck couldn't stand these 6 players, but they're the reason he became immortal. If you've made it this far, smash that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment below about which of these 6 legends would be hardest for you to deal with. Andrew Johns didn't just dislike some guys. He flat out said, "I can't stand him." And over his career, there were 5 names that brought out something darker, something personal. One of these rivalries ended with him needing 27 stitches after getting knocked out cold during an Origin fight. Another was a sledging war so vicious that teammates had to be told to ignore the noise and just focus on the game. But here's the thing, nobody really talks about. Andrew Johns was a genius who could also act like a bully. And these 5 feuds tell you everything about who he was. The 1990s rugby league wasn't like today. It was tougher, meaner, and way more tribal. Johns debuted for Newcastle during a time when the sport was transitioning from old-school amateur grit into a massive commercial enterprise. The halfback position had become something new. Johns himself changed what the role could be. He had a revolutionary kicking game. He had tactical vision that made him control matches with his brain alone. He had swagger, and that swagger made him a target. If you're already hooked by these stories, hit that hype feature right now and give this video some hype. Because these 5 rivalries are about to show you exactly what made Johns dangerous, and exactly what made him impossible to respect sometimes. This is about the moments when talent crossed the line, when competing became something uglier. Let's start with the early warning signs. Number 5, Chris Mortimer. Before Johns became the legend, before he became somebody people actually feared, he was just a confident kid coming into a sport that didn't like confident kids. The game in the early 1990s had unwritten rules, and one of them was that you didn't swagger until you earned the right to swagger. Johns had talent, but he didn't have the years yet. Chris Mortimer represented something older, something that the 1980s had left behind. Mortimer was legendary for his toughness and his uncompromising defensive style. He was part of an old guard that viewed Johns' flashy approach as disrespectful, like the kid was saying that everything the old guys did didn't matter anymore. When Johns was establishing himself at Newcastle in the early 90s, matches against veterans like Mortimer were exercises in putting the kid in his place. This wasn't about football. This was about hierarchy. Mortimer didn't appreciate Johns' confidence and showed that through physical intimidation. He tested Johns repeatedly, hitting him late and hard, making sure the younger player knew that talent alone wouldn't let you survive. But Johns didn't back down. He absorbed the punishment and kept coming back. This early exposure helped forge the mental toughness that eventually made Johns nearly impossible to rattle. The thing is, this conflict was necessary. As much as it was about arrogance and testing boundaries, it was also about a young player refusing to be intimidated by reputation. Johns was cocky. Yeah, but he was cocky because he was that good. And when the old guard couldn't slow him down through violence alone, they had to accept that the game was changing. Number 4, Steve and Kerrod Walters. State of Origin isn't rugby league. It's something else entirely. By the mid-1990s, Andrew Johns was entering this arena as a young superstar, and Queensland didn't care that he was brilliant. They cared that he was New South Wales. The Walters brothers, Steve and Kerrod, represented Queensland's old guard, the hookers who had defined the position during the Brisbane Broncos era. They didn't need to like Johns. They needed to break him. The strategy was simple and brutal. Johns was identified immediately as the engine of New South Wales. If you could disrupt Johns, you disrupted everything. So Queensland made a choice: target him physically, make him think about his safety instead of playmaking, force him to worry about surviving instead of creating. This was systematic tactical war. The Walters brothers were the executors of that strategy. They hit Johns late after he passed the ball. They targeted him in the ruck. They made sure that every time he tried to create, he paid a physical price. Kerrod Walters, in particular, was known for a rugged style of play that fit perfectly into Queensland's approach. When Johns debuted for New South Wales, he became public enemy number one in the Origin arena. The toll of these matches was visible. Johns' face would swell. His body would absorb punishment that modern players don't experience anymore. But here's the thing worth noting and worth criticising. Johns participated in this culture. He accepted that this was the price of playing at this level. He didn't complain. He came back for more. And that willingness to absorb punishment without complaint actually enabled the culture to continue. The Walters brothers weren't unique in this approach. This was Queensland Rugby League. This was how they maintained their dominance. Number 3, Terry Hill Newcastle versus Manly wasn't just a game. It was tribal warfare dressed up in rugby league uniforms. By the mid to late 1990s, these two clubs had a rivalry that went beyond anything rational. When these two sides met, people lost perspective. Games that should have been forgotten became personal narratives that lasted for years. Terry Hill was the most prolific sledger in rugby league history. His verbal assaults were described as not fit for publication, which is a way of saying they were absolutely vicious and designed to burrow into your brain and make you doubt yourself. Hill's role on the field was to get inside Johns' head, to make him angry, to make him lose focus, and he brought backup. Ricky Stewart, another Manly player, worked alongside Hill to create a relentless barrage of psychological warfare. Stewart once mocked Johns by saying he was weak for not taking a pay cut to keep his brother Matty at the club. The goal was to make Johns feel small, to make him feel like his talent didn't matter, to make him rage. Hill's favourite line was simple: "You're a reserve grader." He'd say it over and over, dismissing Johns' accomplishments with a phrase designed to lodge itself in your confidence like a splinter. And it worked sometimes. Johns would get angry. He'd get caught up in the personal nature rather than just playing football. In a 1999 opener at Stadium Australia, Hill scored first, trying to set the tone. Then Johns took over, scoring a try and kicking a field goal to help Newcastle win 41-18. The violence that accompanied this was staggering. Tony Butterfield, a Newcastle prop, was accused of spitting on Terry Hill during a 1997 semi-final. Butterfield claimed it was accidental, but then said something revealing. "When the game starts, we just want to tear each other's heads off." That's the mentality that defined this era. The sledging was psychological, yes, but it was designed to push everyone toward genuine violence. Malcolm Riley, the Newcastle coach, had to specifically instruct his players not to let Manly's sledging distract them. And Johns' response to all this? Sometimes he was brilliant and rose above it. Sometimes he got sucked in and let his ego take over. Both versions of Johns existed in this rivalry. Number 2, Jamie Goddard and the Cattle Dog. The 1997 State of Origin Series Game 3 produced the single most famous physical confrontation of Andrew Johns' career. This is the moment that separates Johns' story into before and after. This is the moment that people still talk about decades later. And this moment reveals everything ugly about the era and about Johns' participation in a culture that valued toughness over sense. Jamie Goddard was an honest Queensland rake, a hard-working forward who would have been forgotten entirely if not for what happened in this match. Goddard is remembered because of 27 stitches and one perfectly timed punch that dropped the 8th Immortal flat on his back. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't a random brawl. This was orchestrated violence. The New South Wales coach was Tommy Raudonikis, and Raudonikis had a strategy. In a scrum, he would scream a code word from the sideline. That code word was cattle dog. When cattle dog was screamed, every NSW player was supposed to engage in an all-in brawl. The logic was that a fight would unsettle Queensland and demonstrate NSW physical dominance. It was a calculated tactical maneuver disguised as spontaneous violence. When Raudonikis screamed cattle dog, NSW forwards responded instantly. Mark Carroll, called Spud, stood up in the pack and smashed Craig Smith between the eyes, knocking him completely out. That was the signal. That was the moment everything became chaos. In that chaos, Andrew Johns and Jamie Goddard found themselves facing each other. In that first exchange, Johns believed he was winning. He landed several hits on Goddard before they were separated. Johns was feeling the adrenaline, feeling like he was dominant. But then something happened that Johns didn't anticipate. He was fueled by the cattle dog call. He was fueled by the need to prove NSW toughness. He sidestepped the touch judge who was trying to separate them and went hunting for a second dig. Johns literally went back into the fight looking for another round. That was his mistake. As Johns approached Goddard for the second time, Goddard landed a perfectly timed right jab directly on Johns' face. Johns went down hard, knocked completely out cold. When he woke up, his lip was torn open in a way that required 27 stitches to repair, 20 on the outside, 7 on the inside. Dr. Nathan Gibbs administered those stitches while Johns tried to process what had happened. He'd been beaten, he'd been embarrassed, and it was his own overconfidence that caused it. But the cattle dog incident didn't end there. The aftermath in the dressing sheds was brutal. Johns was still groggy from the knockout, still not thinking straight. He fell asleep on the bench while being treated. Tommy Raudonikis, the same coach who had orchestrated the entire brawl, woke Johns up by yelling at him. Raudonikis berated him, screamed at him, and then ordered him back out onto the field. Despite his injuries, despite his lip being split open, despite the fact that his mouthguard couldn't even fit because of the swelling, Johns went back out. And this is where Johns' reputation for toughness becomes something to criticize, not admire. Johns returned to the field while severely injured because of a cultural expectation that had been built over decades. Letting down the tribe was worse than breaking your body. Physical suffering was a badge of honor, and the system had trained Johns to accept this. There's a surreal footnote to the cattle dog incident. Both Johns and Goddard were represented by the same lawyer, Jeff Bellew, in the judiciary hearing. Think about that. They were supposed to be adversaries, but they shared legal counsel. The outcome was that both received 2-week suspensions, an almost symmetrical punishment for an asymmetrical fight. But what's remarkable is what happened next. Johns and Goddard shook hands and swapped jerseys in the sheds after the match. This was the code of the era. You could absolutely destroy each other on the field and then be mates in the sheds. Goddard has reflected on the incident with humility over the years, calling it a lucky punch and saying that he still keeps Johns' jersey at home as a prized possession. There's mutual respect there. There's even affection. But there's also a troubling truth. The culture that led to Johns getting knocked out and returning to play while severely injured was never really challenged or changed. It just became a story. Number 1, Brett Finch. By 2004, rugby league was different. The early brutality of the 1990s had evolved into something more modern, more professional in some ways, but still deeply competitive. Brett Finch was the Sydney Roosters' halfback, and Finch represented the next generation of playmakers who grew up watching Johns and refused to be intimidated by his reputation. Finch was cocky in his own right. Finch believed he was elite, and when Newcastle played Sydney, these two playmakers engaged in a different kind of rivalry. The 2004 season was tumultuous for Johns. There was contract speculation, there were injury concerns, there was a high-profile offer to switch to rugby union. When he played Sydney, he was frustrated. He was desperate. He was feeling his mortality in a way he hadn't before. The Roosters were dominant. Newcastle was struggling. Johns was dealing with the reality that maybe his era was ending. On-field microphones captured Johns and Finch screaming at each other during that 2004 clash. This wasn't subtle sledging. This wasn't the calculated psychological warfare of Terry Hill. This was two elite playmakers losing decorum, screaming because they were frustrated and angry and wanted to establish dominance. It looked like a breakdown of professional conduct. It looked personal in a way that felt different from earlier rivalries. The context mattered. In 2003, the Roosters had beaten Newcastle narrowly in a high-error match. The Roosters' strategy was to use aggressive defensive line speed to negate Johns' kicking time, to rush up on him before he could execute his tactical genius. Johns, returning from a broken back, was physically vulnerable. The Roosters targeted that vulnerability. So when 2004 came around, the animosity had been built. Johns was frustrated. Finch wanted to beat him, and they screamed at each other like two competitors who'd lost the ability to contain their anger. But here's what happened that separates the Finch rivalry from the Goddard rivalry, from the Walters rivalry from the Hill rivalry. Johns and Finch eventually worked together in the media. Both became prominent figures on television. They appeared together on the Matty Johns Show, on Fox League programs. They had to reconcile, and in that reconciliation, something shifted. Johns and Finch began to respect each other's tactical knowledge. The screaming match of 2004 became a story they could laugh about. The intensity that had seemed like personal hatred was revealed to be white line fever, the kind of competitiveness that burns hot during a match and cools down once you're out of uniform. This evolution from bitter adversaries to media collaborators isn't unique to Johns and Finch. It's common in rugby league, but it matters because it suggests something important about Johns' entire career. The rivalries that seemed so vicious and personal at the time weren't necessarily rooted in lasting animus. They were professional intensity. They were the competition between elite athletes who needed to dominate to survive. The hatred that fans perceived was actually just very, very good rugby league players refusing to lose. So what does this all mean? Andrew Johns provoked conflict because he was swagger personified. He was technically brilliant, yes, but he was also arrogant. He was willing to cross lines. He participated in a culture that valued toughness over sense. He got knocked out by Jamie Goddard and went back out to play. He screamed at Brett Finch. He absorbed physical punishment without complaint. He let Terry Hill get under his skin sometimes and responded with pure anger rather than grace. Johns' legacy isn't diminished by these flaws. If anything, it's complicated by them. The same competitive fire that made him a target was also what made him great. The same swagger that created enemies was necessary to dominate at the highest level. The same willingness to absorb punishment was what separated good players from immortals. Matty Johns, his brother, helped humanize these rivalries by telling them as comedic anecdotes, by pulling back and showing the humanity underneath the violence. And slowly, the narrative shifted. The person who seemed like a bully or a hothead when he was playing was revealed to be someone whose intensity was contextual, whose hatred was professional, whose greatest weakness was never knowing when to stop. These 5 rivalries, from Mortimer to Goddard, to the Walters brothers, to Terry Hill, to Brett Finch, they forged Andrew Johns into the 8th Immortal. They weren't distractions from his genius. They were the environment that necessitated his excellence, and in the end, every one of those adversaries came to respect him. That respect didn't erase the ugly moments, but it contextualized them. Like this video, subscribe for more rugby league deep dives, and comment which of these rivalries was truly the wildest. Thanks for watching.